Hello, I'm Tom Dozier, and I'm happy to be able to make this presentation to you on conditioned and unconditioned responses of misophonia. I'm going to talk about the misophonia response chain, what is happening in this process, a little bit about Pavlovian conditioning and misophonia and how much this is an important part of misophonia. Conditioned aversive reflex, that's probably a term you have not heard, but is one that I use to describe something that's very common that happens in our lives. And then a conceptualization of misophonia and the implications for treatment that has. So first let me start by talking some of the uniqueness of misophonia sufferers. We often hear, oh, we're all alike. We all have the same triggers and we all develops in childhood and we're just all the same. But we're not. We find in this study of over 1,000 people that the age of onset was quite varied. Now there was a very nice distribution around ages 9 and 10. But notice that the tail goes all the way out to as old as individuals as we had participating. So misophonia can develop at any age. It's just more likely to develop in childhood. About the triggers, yeah, there's a lot of commonality. 96% of the people had mouth sounds, chewing sounds. But that means that 4% of the people did not. So everyone does not have chewing sound triggers. And then breathing sound was very common. But again, a lot of people do not have those triggers. And many different kinds of triggers. Also, visual triggers are a very important part of misophonia. 76% of these people had triggers to open mouth chewing. 47% had triggers to leg jiggling, and there's no auditory component to leg jiggling, and 17% to hair twirling. Again, no auditory component. 92% of the people in this survey reported visual triggers. So if you're considering a person's severity of misophonia and you're only looking at the auditory triggers, you may be missing a large part of what's disruptive to their lives. Other triggers occurred, such as feeling of vibration, bumping of a desk, odors, the smell of gum, toothpaste, perfume. One person, just orange peel was their only trigger. The touch of another person, the feeling of the low-frequency bass in music. Virtually any repeating sight, sound, or sensation can be a trigger for someone. So misophonia should be considered a multisensory condition, not a hearing disorder. Now the emotions of misophonia, these are quite common. The anger, the anxiety, the desire to escape, the rage, the disgust. These are very common. And one of the reasons that they're common is because of we're mammals and we have many of the same emotions and the same settings, situations that drive these emotions. And I'll explain the anger in a moment. A simple criterion for misophonia is it's an extreme emotional response, anger, disgust, to commonly occurring innocuous, subtle stimuli, not just sounds. So I want to say that part of the problem with misophonia is I'm going to use it's like an avalanche. We've all seen videos of avalanches and we see all the power of the snow coming down. By the way, this snowboarder turns out to be fine. But as we look at an avalanche, as we think of an avalanche, what we think of is the extreme emotion, the extreme avalanche, the power, the tumult, the energy that's there. And we see all of the snow crashing down the hill and engulfing people in its way. And that's what we think of as an avalanche. But where did the avalanche start? Right? It started with an invisible slip of the snow, a little spot here, and then, boom, it became the enormous avalanche with all the power that we typically think of. Well, this is a great analogy for misophonia. Because misophonia has this enormous tumult of emotion and distress, and that's what people will tell us when they tell us about misophonia. But where did the misophonia response start? where it starts, it's reported this way: trigger, anger, distress, and outward behavior. But if we watch this little girl, we're going to see something that I call the initial physical response, or the initial physical reflex. Watch this girl's response to a sniff. Wow, that was a jolt. Right? So when she hears a sniff, her brain is basically tasering her calves. And that is quite a jolt to her system. Now, can you imagine her sitting beside her brother doing homeschooling and her brother sniffing, which they did and he did. And that jolt to her calves over time is going to be very disruptive. So if we look at this initial physical reflex, I'm going to propose that that's a Pavlovian conditioned reflex response. The extreme emotions, I'm going to show you that there's data to support that that's a conditioned emotional response. The stress response, I believe, is an unconditioned response. It's an unconditioned response to this horrible, distressing emotions and experience, and so that's our unconditioned response, reflex response of misophonia. And then this is going to elicit or evoke coping behaviors, outward behaviors, trying to get away from the sound, trying to make it stop. And these are either operant or instrumental conditioned behaviors, or they may be unconditioned reflex responses such as fight or flight. That initial physical reflex is a key component of misophonia. And I had saw it 5 years ago, and every article that I've published, everything I've written includes information about this reflex, but yet it's not well understood. So a couple of years ago, Kate Morrison and I decided to do this study where we would expose people to weak triggers and have them report the physical sensations that they had and the emotions. This was published in the American Journal of Psychology. We're delighted to get it published there. The study tested 26 people to weak trigger stimuli, so weak that it didn't trigger them at first, and then we raised the stimulus up and up until it did. We used 2 auditory triggers, 1 visual, and we had a wide variety of responses, but 100% of the people reported a physical sensation to 1 or more of their triggers. Most reported them to all of their triggers. 30% of the people had situations where they felt a physical response but had no emotion, and 15% had situations where they felt an emotional response but no physical response. So people were more likely to say, I had a physical response but no emotion, than I had an emotion but no physical response. And these physical responses are usually invisible. It's not something you're going to watch a person with misophonia and see. So here's what we had. We have 20 different responses, groups that we broke it into. Shoulders, hands, and neck were by far the most common. But then we had chest, back, abdomen, jaws, thighs, general tensing, they couldn't tell where it was, sexual response of 2 people. Again, other things, literally from head to toe, and everywhere in between. So this physical response was very, very common. It was there in every one of them. Now to validate, because this study was done with self-report, that is inherently unreliable. Self-report is people take that very skeptically. And so we decided to observe and measure this physical response. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to validate that this muscle flinch was there using direct observation. We wanted to watch it and see it in individuals with misophonia. And we wanted to measure the timing from the stimulus to the response. And so we used visual observation of the person and electromyography to measure the muscle response. So here's a response of Bonnie, where we have a timing pulse, nothing's happening. The trigger starts for 380 milliseconds, and about 200 milliseconds into it, we see muscles start firing. There's a deltoid response and calf muscles. And that 200 milliseconds was fairly average, predictable. Then for visual triggers, it was a slower response time. There's a 3-second trigger, and after about 350 milliseconds we see the calves firing, the paraspinals, and the deltoids. So again, visual stimuli, muscle movement. So in all three participants, we were able to visually observe an immediate physical motion in their body when they were triggered. Two of the individuals, it was a tick-like motion, and one was very distinct muscles. We could tell where that was coming from. In the person with the more distinct muscle responses, we were able to use electromyography and measure it consistently. And the stimulus to the response delay for auditory triggers was 200 milliseconds, and for visual stimuli it was about 350 milliseconds. And that 200 milliseconds is interesting because if I pop a balloon behind someone, the response is going to be closer to 60 to 80 milliseconds. Well, there's another 120 milliseconds for processing, and we find that a conditioned physical response is controlled by a complex stimulus. It includes the setting, the situation, the social expectations, and many things. And so that supports that this is a conditioned physical response. Now, if we look at Pavlovian conditioning, there's two ways to think about it. We had the bell and the meat, and the dog salivated. So we're traditionally view is that the bell and the meat become associated so that the bell acts like the meat. An alternate view, which is more consistent with recent brain research, is that the bell, the stimulus, becomes associated with the salivation glands so that the bell elicits the salivation glands. And this was shown in an experiment by Donahoe in Vegas, where there was a half-second delay between the stimulus and the response. And with that half second, they could do forward conditioning, they could do backward conditioning, they could see when it would condition and when it would not. And their conclusion was that the critical temporal relation is between the conditioned stimulus, the bell, and the unconditioned response, the salivation, not between the bell and the meat. So essentially, the conditioned stimulus becomes associated with the unconditioned response. Now in misophonia, this is important because there is no unconditioned stimulus to cause the response. There's nothing equivalent of the meat. We have a repeating stimulus. Typically it's a sound. Typically it's an eating sound. And there is an unconscious physical action. So there's the stimulus, and then there is this action that mates and ties to that stimulus. So it's crunch, and that is our initial physical reflex. So any auditory stimulus and an unconscious physical response or action, which is usually a thoughtful component of like, that's not fair, or that's not right, or I don't like that, or they're not supposed to do that. Then there's a thought, some muscle motion there. How about some real examples here? So we have this stimulus, and maybe it's something that you think is unfair, and there's anger, and that would give a little bit of irritation, a fist clench or a jaw clench. Maybe it's a feeling of anxiety, and there's a little shoulder clenching there. Maybe the person is concerned or shocked, like, oh no, and they hold their breath. So John remembers the night actually, that he developed misophonia. He was sharing a room with his brother. He couldn't sleep. He had anxiety, generalized anxiety. And he was hearing his brother breathe over and over again. And finally he went to a different room and he went to sleep. But after that one night, every time he heard his brother breathe, it triggered him. I have two cases of individuals who had mockingbirds build nests near their homes. One was right outside their window. One was in front of the house. And over a period of time, they developed reflexes to the chirp of mockingbirds. One man developed a jaw clench. I hate that sound. Another one developed goosebumps on his arms. There was a case of Carla's mother. Carla had misophonia. to one of her brothers, and mother was concerned that Carla was going to develop a trigger to her brother doing a tap, click, click, click with his teeth when they were riding in the car. And mother was like, "Oh, Johnny, stop that. Oh, Johnny, don't do that." Well, Carla didn't develop a trigger to that sound, but mother, who didn't have misophonia, did. Now, sometimes this unconscious response is part of another behavior. So, for example, the one girl, actually it's Carla, was mentioning, that she would stand up and yell at her brother, "Stop staring at me," at the table, and he's over there chewing with his mouth open. And when she heard small snippets of her brother chewing, her arms jerked and her legs jerked. The very muscles she was using when she was at the dinner table hearing her brother's open-mouthed chewing. Sarah had asthma, and she would try to breathe, and she would hunch her shoulders over, and she'd squint her face, and she'd pull for the air. And when she heard a trigger, her shoulders came forward, her face scrunched, and her lungs went and tried to breathe. One man was a Marine in the Afghanistan conflict, and they would go out on patrol, very stressful. Your arms, you're all tight, you're worried, your life's in danger. And then they get back in these very close air-conditioned quarters, and they're eating, and somebody's right beside you. And when he would hear a crunch, somebody chewing, his head would flinch to the right, and his right arm would jerk like he's taking a blow. But it didn't matter if it was on his right or his left. His head still flinched to the right. So, conditioned aversive reflexes. These are Pavlovian conditioning, and this is actually quite common, but very much not reported. Doctors, especially surgeons, get this to their pagers. So Gene Lipoff was a trauma center surgeon. He had a pager, old school, a little block that hooks on your belt that goes brrr and vibrates when you're needed. Well, when that pager went off, he was going to have to go to the trauma center, and he was going to see something horrible. And so he'd have this little dread response. He said, "I'm just like, oh, what am I going to have to deal with today?" And about a month or two into that job, his pager would go off, and boop, there goes his shoulders up every time. Oh, what am I going to have to deal with? And I said, "Gene, how long did that shoulder flinch persist?" He said, "Well, until I got a different job and I got rid of my pager. Every time the pager went off, my shoulders went up." So I did just a informal study, little survey with doctors. I bought 10 responses of doctors that had pagers and said, "Did you develop a unique, distinct physical response to your pager?" 6 said yes, 4 no. I have friends that are professionals that one developed a chest muscle flinch when the phone would ring, and another had a sensation down his leg, and a third friend had a job overseas for 3 years where he got a lot of problems to deal with by phone. And he said, I would notice that the phone would ring and I'd kind of tense my shoulders. He said, but I don't think it was a reflex. I think it was just concern over what I was going to have to deal with. I said, well, Dale, when you got home and you didn't have any of these responsibilities and your phone rang, did you notice anything? He says, yes, my shoulders went up and I changed my ringtone. So this is very common. And Julie Theobald, she's a friend of mine who had a cancer treatment, and her chemotherapy was to go in for a day and then come home with a pump that would continually, intermittently inject the chemotherapy chemicals into the bloodstream, and it would go brrr, and it would vibrate. She would feel it vibrate, she would hear it. And we did some testing, and we discovered that the muscles in her lower back would clench every time that pump went off. Now, conditioned reflexes can be good. Infants develop conditioned reflexes, and there's some interesting research on this area where you pair cuddling and holding and rocking and touching in mother's voice, and you find that the baby starts to fuss. Mommy speaks, the baby relaxes. And that only happens through experience. So that's a very positive conditioned reflex. Now, the emotional responses were very well documented by Sukhminder Kumar. And in a study that he did and his colleagues, was presented in 2015 at the Misophonia Association convention. And this presentation was great because he could make his commentary there. And he talked about the function of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that those little spots behind the eyebrows are known to regulate emotions, to either boost them or to reduce them. And it's also involved in associative learning of emotions, basically learning conditioned emotional responses. So something that's neutral either becomes a positive emotion stimulus or becomes a negative emotion stimulus. Also, the anterior insular cortex, which does internal and external sensation, that's really the kind of the area that spawns all of the activity. And there was also a lot of activity when people who had misophonia between the AIC and the hippocampus and amygdala, but that's believed to be more the emotional distress. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex was thought to be the structure that was controlling the emotional response. That in individuals with misophonia, there was this high response between the AIC and the VMPFC, and it actually boosted the emotional response of people with misophonia. But with people without misophonia, it actually served to retard that response or to inhibit that response. So their conclusion was, in misophonic subjects, the connectivity between the VMPFC and the anterior insula is positive, indicating that the VMPFC, rather than regulating, is boosting the activity of the anterior insula. Given the role of the VMPFC in learning associations, our data is consistent with the view that aberrant associations represented in the VMPFC drive areas involved in emotion processing. And kind of in plain English, translated into Portuguese, misophonia emotions are conditioned emotional responses. They develop through experience with the triggers, and the emotions are involuntary responses. So, but why the anger? Well, with mammals, when we are assaulted, we will have an anger response. This has been done with humans with aversive sounds and other aversive stimuli, and with these docile rats, these really calm, peaceful rats, they put them in a cage that had an electric grid, and they could shock them electrically. And if the rats were facing kind of forward or away from each other, they go, ah, and they'd just stay there. But if they were facing toward each other, it was like, ah, and then they would fight for about a second only, and then stop. Fight, stop. So this urge for aggression is common in mammals anytime we are assaulted. And that initial physical reflex is like a jolt, boom, to the body. It is like an assault. Now, the unconditioned stress response was documented by Edelstein, Brang, Rao, and Ramachandran in one of the early studies that was saying, is this real? Right? Are these extreme emotions real because they were just self-report? And so in their surveys of people with misophonia, the people reported tachycardia, an increased heart rate, high heart rate, general muscle tension, and sweating. But the skin conductance response was used to measure, to validate these self-reports. And what it showed is that when a person with misophonia started to hear a trigger stimulus, about 2 seconds into it, they started having a rise in their skin conductance that continued to rise for the duration of the trigger. So this validated the fact that these reported emotions are very real. Well, how does misophonia strengthen and expand? Because we know many people start with one trigger stimulus and it gets worse and worse over time. So anytime a person is experiencing misophonia distress, they're having repeated triggers, they're having this distress reaction, they're strengthening their physical reflex through Pavlovian conditioning. Because it's like crunch, I hate that. That strengthens the reflex. It strengthens the emotional response by the experience of the VMPFC. When a person gets tough with misophonia, they try to face it head on and say, I can endure this. Misophonia almost virtually always wins. It gets worse. And that's, for example, if a person is trying to use exposure and response prevention therapy, that's looking at the first, the trigger, and the last, the overt outward behavior, and not seeing what in the middle. And misophonia typically gets worse. New triggers will develop that anytime you have paired stimuli, then you can develop a new trigger. So if a person has a bag of potato chips and it's crinkle, crunch, perfect timing that the crinkle becomes a trigger. The person hears somebody chewing, they see their jaw movement. Now the jaw movement is being paired with that same physical response of the chewing, and the jaw movement becomes a trigger. And once these visual triggers develop, they will last independently, even if the triggering to the chewing sound goes away. You also get stimulus generalization, where there is a sound that's similar, slightly different, new person, new setting. The triggers will expand and spread. And in my study that we were testing the people for their response, 40% of the people reported different muscle responses for different triggers. So if they heard a chewing, their fists would clench, and if they heard sniffing, their toes might curl, meaning that they developed misophonia twice independently. This is brain plasticity at its absolute worst. How do we make it decline? Well, we can decline by breaking that misophonia stimulus response cycle. If a person can relax when they go into a situation, they can have a lower response, which can help to bring down the response. But most powerfully, if a person can relax that muscle so that it's crunch, relax, crunch, relax, then it can decay and die out. And that's brain plasticity at its best. So treatments for misophonia that we use, apply these principles to, looking to this, if we can eliminate that initial physical flinch, then we can greatly reduce or eliminate a person's misophonic response. So what I recommend with people that I work with is an hour per day of muscle relaxation training using progressive muscle relaxation. And then learning to relax before the triggers and through the triggers, depending upon their sensitivity. We have to do this in artificial situations with recordings. In people who have less severe misophonia, they can often relax in real life situations, reduce their distress from the trigger, and actually reduce their future response. We can also pair triggers with very positive stimuli. In young children, you can play games of tickling and wrestling while they're hearing triggers, or playing video games while they're hearing triggers, and the response can die out. Or if a person has something that just fills their heart with joy by looking at cute dog pictures or dog videos or pictures of their dog, and they're looking at the video of the dog and they're hearing little triggers, and again, the response can die out. And this is predictably beneficial. So in conclusion, misophonia is a multisensory, typically auditory and visual, but it is a multisensory disorder. Misophonia is reported as an extreme emotional and physiological response to subtle stimuli, but this conceptualization of misophonia is really incomplete. What we find is that misophonia is more likely a physical flinch, that initial physical reflex. Then we have the extreme emotions. We have the physiological distress, that stress, unconditioned stress response. And we have overt, outward behavior of trying to make it stop or get away from it. So misophonia is a conditioned aversive reflex disorder. And with that, I say thank you very much. I'm happy to be able to present to you today.